Hello, this is Pastor Rick, and I'm going to welcome you to the Sunday Forum for this Sunday, July the 30th, where we have a tough topic, a sensitive topic, in some ways a strange topic, but it's one that's important and it's being discussed everywhere. You need to know that. Our topic for our discussions at home during this special summer session of Table Talks in the Sunday Forum is what's wrong with men? What's wrong with men? And we're going to look at the shifting definition of masculinity and how that plays out in the church. Now, to describe what's happening, let me go back to my own education and my own upbringing in my family, because I can remember as a small child going with my mom and dad to some parties. And my dad would always use the same line in introducing my mom. He'd always say, here is my wife Shirley, she's my better half. Always my better half. And everybody would laugh. And yet we know, given the culture in the 1950s and 60s, that probably wasn't true in many ways because men had all the advantages, right? And people knew that. So it was sort of flattery. Yes, it was flattering. And to be quite honest, it was probably true in many cases. And yet, it was being said within a larger culture where males and men dominated. And that sort of reflects the Sistine Chapel. I have to point to that because when Michelangelo paints Genesis 2, the creation account, because even the notion of better half, that whole reference is to the creation account in Genesis 2, where God makes Adam, and Adam is alone, and God recognizes he needs a helpmate. And so then he puts Adam to sleep, remember that? The creation of Eve, this marvelous creation, happens while Adam is sleeping. Now, how did Michelangelo paint that? Well, he did it in a male-dominated way. The whole center panel of the Sistine Chapel is the creation of Adam. And then off to the side, in a smaller panel, is the creation of Eve. Even though they're meant to be helpmates and partners in the story in Genesis, that's the theology behind it, Michelangelo reflected sort of our culture up into the 50s and 60s, where again, the man was more important and the woman took a secondary place, even though my dad would introduce his wife as his better half. But a lot has happened since then, and we have to say this whole notion of equality is really a modern invention, although I think it goes back to Genesis 2. Nevertheless, as Simone de Beauvoir wrote in her famous book, The Second Sex, she wrote it in 1949, so she's way ahead of her time, which is why many of us read her in college. She writes this: woman has always been man's dependent, if not his slave. So it's a real strong critique. The two sexes have never shared the world in equality. And that's what she wrote in 1941. However, 3/4 of a century later, we have to say a lot of that has happened, where men and women, especially here in North America, have reached some elements of equity. Now, we're not going to discuss the Women's March for Equity and all the issues that still remain unresolved in our culture. That's not the focus of the day. It is true that women have made massive progress, which is what has caused a crisis now for men, and that's what's being recognized everywhere. By a variety of metrics, we see this all over, in books now, in journals, and on the internet. Men are falling behind in parity. And now you might be shocked to hear that, but it's just true in all the statistics, and I'm going to share a few of them in just a moment. But so many books now point to what this new troubling aspect about what's happening with our men. That our men, especially young men, are failing. So, again, some of you have been following this, maybe with the statistics, but some of you just know this when you look at your kids and your grandkids and how often young men, they're staying home a lot longer. How nice is that to be taken care of by your parents or your mother? She's doing all your laundry and you can sit home and watch video games. And often young women are frustrated by this development because they want to go out with a mature man, and often the men that they like are still staying at home. They prefer playing video games. They don't know how to interact. And often the response for these young women is, grow up, or I'm taking off. So that's anecdotal. But here we see in grades K through 12 that young girls are performing higher, getting better grades than boys by a large percentage. College degrees, it's the same thing. 7 of every 10 college degrees are women today, well outperforming men. But that's also in the work performance and satisfaction at work. Well, women are much more satisfied with their work than men. In fact, 1 of every 9 men in their prime working age, 40s and 50s, have stepped out of the workforce. Why is that? But also in some of the negative statistics, opioid addiction, men dominate the misuse of drugs, or issues of crime, who is incarcerated in our prisons, men to a large extent. Or when we take a look at violent crime, especially recently the use of guns, who's using a gun? It's not our young women. For the most part, it's men. And so statistic after statistic points to something troubling, that the ground under men is shifting. For some reason, they're not able to adapt. They can't define now what masculinity means in this modern world. And so again, often young men will stay home, they feel isolated, they prefer games to interaction, and more they're just feeling awkward around women. They don't know how to act, what to say. They're afraid to say the wrong thing, to overstep boundaries. And they hear a lot about toxic masculinity. And so for many of them, they just put masculinity and toxic together. One equals the other. And so it's easier to stay at home and not to interact at all. So, socially, economically, personally, professionally, men are falling behind. And as Richard Raves talks about, he says, nobody predicted that women would overtake men so rapidly. He writes that in his book, interesting, the title of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What Can We Do About It? Well, that title then says it all. And he also points to the fact that this shift between the power of men and women, the success socially, politically, economically of women now, it's like the needles of a magnet compass reversing their polarities. And I love that. It's like that magnet reversing their polarities. So the response, you're going to see it everywhere. And there are people from the left and the right who recognize this problem now, who define it differently, but I think everyone recognizes we have an issue and we have to address it. 2, I would say, polarities that we want to avoid, and one is the toxic masculinity on the one hand. On the other, let's just go back to the way it was in the 1950s. Let's call that the old school masculinity. On the toxic masculinity, you have people like Andrew Tate, who's just lifting up caveman behavior. But he's drawn a huge following among young men of modeling, I would say, the worst antisocial behavior you can imagine. Others know that's an extreme, but then they go into the old school. Let's just go back to the way it was with my parents, for example. And of course, we know you can't go back to the 1950s. There's just not a great example. And so people are trying to then define, what does masculinity mean today that's more pro-social, that's more pro-family, that's constructive, that's using the strengths of a man and a man's behavior in constructive ways and not in destructive ways. Now, what I'm encouraging is a discussion about masculinity and the role of men and young boys at home. And for that, there's a lot of good literature out there to read. There's good podcasts, journal articles, you name it. People are addressing this now. It's an issue you'll want to talk to with your kids and grandkids, and maybe with your friends and family. Now, what can the church add to all the other literature that's out there? Let me just add 5 things. And this is for our consideration and for our discussion here at Emmanuel. The first, let's not define masculinity in isolation to femininity. I think both of these topics need to be defined and discussed together. This is Genesis 2, where we have Adam and Eve, and you can't define one without the other. And I think the scriptures encourages us to be a man, but to be so socially over against women, and of course, and other men as well. So let's make sure that we're defining both, and that men and women are both in the same room as we define them. That's the first. The second, we need role models, not just books that define masculinity, for example. We need to see it. And I have to say, even though this makes sense, and I know you're nodding at home, yeah, of course, we need to be mentor men and women, mentor men and women. Often in the church, we don't do that. So in Sunday school, for example, we only have women teachers. And so in some churches, you don't model being taught by both men and women. And so the idea there is because the mother is at home and nurturing, then in Sunday school, it's only women who are nurturing. And of course, part of masculinity has to also lift up that nurturing, protective nature in men as well. And so I believe, like in Proverbs, you have a man who's mentoring his young son. And he walks him then through the village, and they see Lady Wisdom, and he points out how the young man should choose her, Wisdom, as his companion, and not the other women in town. So, role models. Third, this is not a zero-sum game. It's not like if men increase and become more successful, that women will decrease, or that if women increase, men will decrease. But this is often how it's defined. If a woman gets the job, then the man can't get that job. And I think we have to lay that aside and say we want both men and women to thrive. How can they thrive both separately and together? Here, the notion of Paul, where he calls us to be the body of Christ. So the church should be an example where both men and women can thrive together, and we model that, the body functioning well in coordination together to the rest of the world. That's third. Fourth, I want to say there's not one defining way to get at masculinity or femininity. Now, some of us probably know that instinctively. So if you grew up as a young girl, some are playing with Barbies and some are playing out in the baseball field or playing soccer, right? There are tomboys and there are Barbies. We want to give young women a large playing field to define femininity, just like we want to do that with men. We also want to allow the freedom for men also to discover some of their inner strengths and to become how God has created them. And so Paul's idea of the freedom of a Christian, we want to place that also in our definitions of masculinity and give men more room to define what it means to be a man today. And finally, family life is important. Yes, the church should set up modeling and set up teaching about how to be a man. But finally, the family's got to help us in significant ways. And so as the church, we need to promote family life, because it's only with a mother and father within the sibling relationships that often we learn how to become men and women. And so I want to encourage you to have this conversation at home about what it means to be a man today, masculinity, and don't forget also to talk about femininity at the same time. Thanks for joining us on Sunday Forum. Bye-bye now.